The gavel cracked down with a force that echoed through the courtroom, silencing the low murmurs from the packed gallery. At the front, Judge Marshall Davis glared at the defense attorney, his voice dripping with disdain. "Enough! I won't have this circus in my courtroom." The attorney opened his mouth to respond, but the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "If you speak out of turn one more time, I'll hold you in contempt." The tension was palpable. Onlookers shifted in their seats, some casting uneasy glances at each other. Davis's reputation for harsh rulings and short temper was no secret, but today something felt different. His mood was darker, his demeanor even more unpredictable. When Vice President J.D. Vance stepped forward, a hush fell over the room. All eyes were on him as he moved to take the stand. "Ah, the Vice President himself," Davis sneered. "And what brings you to my humble courtroom?" His tone was mocking, laced with open hostility. "Don't expect any special treatment here. You're just another witness, and I run this court." Vance met the judge's glare with a calm, steady gaze. "I'm here to testify on behalf of the accused, Your Honor." Davis leaned back in his chair, a faint, unsettling smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see how long that lasts." His gavel struck again, harder this time. The sound reverberated through the room like a warning shot. The gallery's uneasy shuffling stopped. The air seemed to grow heavier. The courtroom bore witness to a stunning display of judicial bias for the next few minutes. Davis interrupted, berated, and dismissed any attempt at a fair defense. But a subtle shift began as the judge's confidence seemed unshakable. Vance, quietly methodical, presented a single document. One sheet of paper was handed to the clerk with steady hands. It was enough to freeze the judge mid-sentence. "Where did you get that?" Davis barked, his voice rising. The courtroom fell deathly silent. The document had barely been mentioned, but already it seemed to rattle the man who claimed to be the law. The power dynamic was beginning to tilt, and everyone could feel it. This was no ordinary day in court. This was a reckoning. Judge Marshall Davis had spent years cultivating a reputation of absolute authority. His courtroom was his kingdom, his bench a throne from which he ruled unchallenged. Lawyers dreaded drawing his cases, knowing they were likely to face scathing remarks, abrupt interruptions, and rulings that often leaned into bias rather than fairness. His voice was sharp, his manner dismissive. It was his way or no way. That morning, as the courtroom filled, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet dread. Even the air conditioning, set too low, failed to cool the palpable tension. At the defense table sat J.D. Vance. Though typically composed, today he carried the weight of an unjust trial on his shoulders. He had seen powerful figures abuse their positions before, but Judge Davis was a different breed. The man seemed to revel in his ability to humiliate, to crush any opposition without hesitation. Vance, however, wasn't here for a fight, at least not initially. He was here to provide testimony in support of an accused colleague, a case riddled with questionable charges. Yet even before the proceedings began, he could sense that this was no level playing field. Davis entered the courtroom with the air of someone untouchable. His black robes billowed slightly as he moved, his stride deliberate, his expression cold. The gallery hushed as he took his seat, his gavel a mere formality. His presence alone commanded silence. He cast a withering glance at the defense team, his lip curling slightly. This wasn't about justice. This was a spectacle, and Davis was the star. The faint tap of his finger against the bench's polished wood was the only sound for a moment, a rhythm that made the defense attorney glance nervously at his notes. "You're late," Davis snapped at the opposing counsel, though they were right on time. The attorney stammered an apology, but Davis waved it away with a theatrical sigh. Spare me the excuses, I've heard them all before. Let's move on. J.D. Vance observed in silence, his hands clasped in front of him. He had witnessed political theatre many times, but this performance was particularly galling. Davis's overconfidence was on full display. Every sneer, every barked command, every dismissive wave of his hand told the story of a man who believed he was untouchable. The judge's ego was as massive as his scorn for those he deemed beneath him. He interrupted lawyers mid-sentence, dismissed objections without cause, and seemed to relish in the discomfort he created. The entire courtroom was his stage, and today he intended to deliver a show that left no doubt about who held the power. But Vance had seen it before, power overplayed. He knew the arrogance of a man who thought himself invincible. He also knew that such men often left cracks in their armor, small but telling signs of weakness. As Davis leaned back in his chair, a faint, satisfied smirk on his lips, Vance noticed the judge's fingers twitching, barely perceptible, but there. A nervous habit? Perhaps. Or perhaps the smallest hint that Davis's confidence wasn't as unshakable as it seemed. Across the room, a court clerk hurried to bring documents to the bench. Davis barely acknowledged her, snatching the papers from her hands without a glance. "Finally," he muttered. "Now let's see if this defense has anything resembling a legitimate argument." The gallery watched in silence, the tension growing with every word. It wasn't just the defendant on trial today. In a way, it was the very notion of justice itself. And as J.D. Vance sat quietly, his presence steady and unyielding, he made a silent promise to himself. Davis's reign of unchecked power would not go unchallenged, not this time. The trial was underway and the courtroom turned into a battlefield. Judge Davis leaned forward, glaring over his glasses at the defense attorney who struggled to present his case. "Irrelevant," Davis barked. "Move on before I hold you in contempt." Each sharp interruption sent ripples of tension through the room. The defense lawyer glanced at J.D. Vance, his eyes betraying a mix of frustration and fear. Vance nodded a silent message to continue, steadily, methodically, despite the judge's hostility. But Davis wasn't finished. "You think you can sway this court with these weak arguments?" His voice carried across the room, heavy with condescension. "I have no patience for political games, especially not from those who hide behind their so-called principles." He smirked, clearly enjoying his dominance. To Davis, this wasn't just a trial, it was a performance, and he was the star. J.D. Vance remained composed, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He let Davis continue his tirade, never flinching under the judge's disdainful glare. The gallery, a mix of reporters, legal observers, and a few concerned citizens, sat in uneasy silence. They could feel the imbalance of power, the suffocating weight of Davis's authority. It was clear that the judge believed he had the upper hand, that no one in this courtroom had the will or the courage to challenge him. When Vance finally spoke, his tone was measured, almost conversational. "Your Honor, I would like to submit additional evidence regarding the Faith and Family Foundation's financial transparency." Davis's eyes narrowed. "You'll do no such thing. I've heard enough about your so-called charitable contributions. This court doesn't have time for baseless claims." He waved his hand dismissively, a sharp gesture that conveyed absolute finality. But Vance did not back down. "Your Honor," he said, still calm, "this evidence was submitted during discovery and directly pertains to the defendant's character. I believe it would provide important context." "Context?" Davis scoffed, his voice rising. "I decide what's important in this courtroom, and I won't tolerate a political lecture from you, Mr. Vice President." His words dripped with disdain, the title spoken like a curse. The gallery murmured, a ripple of discomfort that Davis quickly silenced with a sharp look. "Order! I'll have order in my court!" The defense attorney took a step forward, attempting to support Vance's point, but Davis silenced him with a booming command. "I said enough! Sit down before I hold you in contempt!" The attorney hesitated, then reluctantly obeyed. The power dynamic was clear. Davis was in complete control, or so he thought. For a moment, the courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of the court reporter's pen. Davis shuffled through his papers, his face a mask of irritation. He seemed almost pleased with himself, as if the act of silencing his opposition satisfied him. But Vance observed closely, noting the slight tremor in the judge's hand as he reached for his gavel. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, but it told Vance what he needed to know. Davis was trying too hard to maintain control, and it was starting to slip. Vance chose his next words carefully. "Your Honor, if I may, I believe the public deserves a full account of the fact. Transparency is crucial in maintaining trust in our legal system." Davis's expression darkened. "Do not lecture me about trust or transparency, Mr. Vance. Your position may hold sway in Washington, but in this courtroom it means nothing." Vance tilted his head slightly, as if considering Davis's words. "Understood, Your Honor. I'm merely advocating for a fair trial, one where all relevant evidence can be examined." "Fair?" Davis nearly spat the word. "You come into my courtroom dragging your political baggage with you and demand fairness?" He leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "I know your type, always looking for a platform, always playing the victim." Vance's expression didn't waver. He met Davis's glare with quiet confidence, refusing to be intimidated. The tension in the room was palpable. Every spectator could feel the power struggle, the invisible line of resistance that Vance had drawn. But Davis wasn't finished. He pointed his gavel at Vance as if it were a weapon. "You think you can outsmart me? Think again. I've seen countless like you, arrogant, entitled, thinking you're above the law. But in my courtroom, I am the law." Vance allowed a pause before responding, his voice steady and deliberate. "I respect your authority, Your Honor. I also respect the rule of law, and I believe that includes presenting all evidence fairly." "Enough," Davis thundered. He slammed his gavel down so hard that it echoed through the chamber. The sound was jarring, a stark reminder of the judge's unchecked power. "I won't have you grandstanding here, not in my courtroom." The gallery exchanged uneasy glances. Davis's outbursts were becoming more frequent, his composure increasingly fragile. Vance remained calm, but inside he could feel the balance of power shifting. Davis's overconfidence, his unwillingness to consider evidence, his blatant hostility, each misstep was adding weight to the growing case against him. And then, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Davis made a small but telling mistake. In his rush to dismiss Vance's evidence, he inadvertently mentioned a sealed document that no one had brought up. Vance caught it immediately, his mind already working through the implications. That slip could be the key to exposing what Davis had been hiding. But Vance kept his discovery to himself for now, letting Davis's arrogance blind him to the trap he was setting for himself. The power struggle was far from over, but for the first time, the once untouchable judge seemed vulnerable. The psychological battle was underway, and Davis didn't even realize he was losing. Judge Davis stared at the document now resting in front of him. His hand trembled as he picked it up, though he tried to mask his unease with a dismissive scoff. "What is this supposed to prove?" he asked, his voice sharp, but lacking the confidence it had just moments earlier. His gavel sat unused, his fingers twitching around it. J.D. Vance stood calm, his expression unreadable. Your Honour, that document outlines a series of financial transfers, funds that seem to coincide with rulings you've made in several high-profile cases. He let the statement hang in the air. The gallery, once subdued, now seemed to lean forward collectively, tension mounting. Davis's face reddened. Ridiculous, baseless allegations without a shred of admissible evidence. He shot a glance at the prosecution, as if looking for backup, but they remained silent. The weight of the courtroom's collective gaze was suffocating, and for the first time, Davis's voice wavered. "I won't entertain this nonsense. Officers, remove him from my courtroom." The bailiffs didn't move. They exchanged uneasy glances, shifting where they stood, as if unsure how to proceed. Davis's command hung unanswered. "Your Honour," Vance continued, his tone steady and deliberate, "I believe you know these transactions are relevant. This isn't conjecture, this is documentation. And if you'll notice," he gestured toward another file in his hand, "there's more where that came from. Deposits made into accounts linked to your re-election campaign, connections to parties who just happened to benefit from your rulings." Davis slammed his gavel down, though it lacked the usual authoritative crack. It was a hollow sound, one that failed to restore order. "This court does not recognize such evidence. This is a smear campaign, pure and simple." His words were quick and clipped, but they only added to the growing unease in the room. Vance stepped closer, maintaining his composure. "I understand your concern, Your Honour, but the records are clear. The transfers, the meetings, the decisions, all tied together. I can have additional witnesses subpoenaed. I can request federal oversight. But I thought it best to bring this to your attention first." Davis froze. His face, once full of bluster, now betrayed a flicker of fear. The courtroom was deathly silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Even those who had no legal background could see the shift in the judge's demeanor. He was no longer the unshakable authority he had portrayed. His attempts to regain control fell flat, his outbursts ringing hollow against the mounting evidence. The gallery murmured. Someone in the back whispered, "Could it be true?" Davis shot a glare in their direction, but it was too late. His courtroom, once his sanctuary, had become a crucible, and the heat was rising. He leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself against a tide he could no longer hold back. This is a conspiracy, a political attack from a man who thinks his title gives him the right to challenge the judiciary. But his words lacked force. His usual venom had turned to desperation. Vance tilted his head slightly, his voice calm, almost pitying. "Your Honour, no title can bend the truth. The evidence speaks for itself. You know that as well as anyone." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "But if you prefer, I can forward these records directly to the relevant authorities. I'm sure they would find them illuminating." Davis opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room felt as though it held its breath. The shift was complete. Where once stood a man who ruled with unchallenged authority, now sat someone cornered, his carefully built facade crumbling. When the lead bailiff finally stepped forward, his movements were slow and deliberate. "Your Honour," he said quietly, almost apologetically, "I think we should pause these proceedings." His voice was respectful, but it was clear he, too, sensed the power shift. Davis's eyes darted around the room. He knew he was no longer in control. The gavel lay unused. His voice, once booming, had lost its impact. The courtroom, once his stage, was now the place where his authority had been unseated. The murmur in the courtroom swelled as the bailiff's quiet words hung in the air. Judge Davis's face, once a mask of arrogance, now betrayed every ounce of panic. He looked to the gallery, to the court officers, even to the prosecution, anyone who might rally to his defense. No one moved, no one spoke. J.D. Vance remained still, his gaze steady, his presence unyielding. He didn't need to raise his voice or call attention to himself. The silence did all the work. The documents, the accusations, the undeniable shift in power, these were more effective than any shouted argument. Davis reached for his gavel one last time, but his hand stopped halfway. He was frozen, his authority slipping away with every passing second. The room's energy had transformed. Where once it was filled with the weight of his dominance, now it was charged with something else. Justice. "Bailiff!" Davis's voice cracked, barely audible. "This is my courtroom. I am the law." The lead bailiff hesitated. He exchanged a glance with his colleagues. None of them stepped forward. None of them followed the judge's order. The realization dawned in Davis's eyes, a flicker of recognition that even he could not deny. "You will do as I say," he shouted, the words echoing through the chamber. But they were met with no response. Vance finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Your Honor, the law is bigger than any one person, no matter how powerful they believe they are." And then it happened. The lead bailiff quietly nodded and two court officers approached the bench. Davis stood, his movements jerky, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to reassert control. "No, you have no right. But his words were cut off as the officers took his arms. The gavel, so often slammed down with authority, now sat forgotten. The once mighty judge was led away in handcuffs, his protests fading into the background murmurs of the courtroom. J.D. Vance watched silently, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to gloat or offer commentary. The actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The courtroom had witnessed a rare and powerful moment. Justice served, power rightfully checked, and a message made clear. No one, not even a judge, was above the law. If you enjoyed this story and believe in standing up for truth and accountability, take a moment to hit the like button. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light, exposing wrongdoing and showing the power of courage and integrity. By subscribing to our channel, you'll stay up to date on compelling narratives, powerful investigations, and the latest in the fight for justice. When you subscribe, you're not just a viewer, you're part of a community that values honesty, transparency, and fairness. Don't miss out on future content that dives deep into the stories that matter. Join us on this journey and help amplify the message of truth and responsibility. Like, subscribe, and let's continue uncovering the untold together.